Okay, so welcome to this session on that. We have an amazing panel of colleagues, very beloved colleagues from Eurodad and the Global South. We have Patricia Miranda, Global Advocacy Director at Latin American and Caribbean Network for Economic, Social, and Climate Justice. I'm going to put my glasses on because where she leads on the development finance and international financial architecture reform from a Latin American and Caribbean perspective. And Patricia has been more than 2 decades of experience in public finance and debt issues, working across civil society, but also on public institutions at national, regional, and global levels. Welcome, Patricia. We will also have Kamal Ramburth. He's a G20 project lead and researcher on debt and development finance at the Institute of Economic Justice in South Africa, specializing in sovereign debt, development finance, economic transformation, and reform of the international financial system. He's also the co-founder of Rethinking Economics for Africa initiative and brings a strong African perspective to the debate on debt and development finance. And last but not least, Jerome Phelps is head of advocacy and debt justice UK, working on advocacy on sovereign debt crisis, debt cancellation, private creditor accountability, and debt legislative reform in the UK. Jerome has extensive experience in policy advocacy and public campaigning, helping to build support for fair approaches to debt resolution and global economic governance. So this is going to be our panel today. I'm Yolanda Fresnillo, coordinating the amazing debt justice team with Chetel and Paulina. We're in the room at Eurodad, and I'll be facilitating this panel. And for an introduction, we heard from Atilla how the tax negotiations at the UN are advancing, giving us some hope, also some risks spotted there. But imagine that we succeed in the UN tax convention negotiations, that we succeed in promoting fossil fuel profit taxes, in promoting progressive tax systems in general all over the world, in the global south. Countries in the global south particularly would be benefiting from that, would be able to raise more money from their taxes to repay external creditors and domestic creditors. So well done, tax people. We will be able to generate profits for the creditors. The conclusion is there's no tax justice without debt justice. They all go together. We need to advance in the different work streams that we're working on at Eurodad and beyond. And this is what we want to discuss today. How do we reform the debt system as well? So we start with Patricia. Patricia, the FFD4 outcome document from Sevilla fell a little bit short from what civil society and global south countries were demanding, particularly on the UN Debt Convention, also on debt cancellation and other issues. However, do you think that FFD4 in Sevilla offered opportunities to advance on debt architecture reform? What would be those opportunities? What FFD4 has left out there for us to work on? Liz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yolanda, and thanks to Eurodad for the invitation to be here. It's always a pleasure to have this exchange with our regional sister organizations. So as Atia mentioned, and you, Yolanda, there is a debt crisis. I mean, debt movements have been warning for a long time about what could happen, and also making proposals and putting proposals on the table. And now it is happening what we said it would happen. The problem is that, well, good for us that we have the right magic ball to say what would happen. But actually, the point is that it's not good for the people that it's more exposed to vulnerabilities and that now have the impact of all this increase in debt. What is, there are different ratios on debt. I know you are aware of all of them, but in general, if we see all the different ratios in terms of debt, everything is so much worse than 10 years ago. If we talk about any region that you want to talk about, it's as double as worse as they were 10 years ago. This is something that we have been raising for a long time. So regarding your question, Yolanda, I think it's also important to remind that during the whole FFP4 process, many stakeholders, of course, us, but also UN delegates and other stakeholders involved in the process called for a debt architecture reform. Now, the thing was, in the end, what does it mean? What does that a debt architecture reform mean? How would it start? Who would run it? What would be their main principles, and so on. So I think that we tried to lead the conversation, and the rationale we used as civil society organizations was first to change the governance. I mean, we have been calling for we had several demands and messages on debt in past financing for development forums. For this one, what we thought was that we need to change governance, as it happened with tax. And all countries, creditors and borrowers need to be seated at the same table, making decisions on the global debt policies rules, which currently doesn't happen. So that was the main point. And then what to have an impact in the whole debt cycle, not only debt restructuring, but also when a country starts to negotiate a new loan, and the need to have access to concessional financing. So we needed to address the whole debt cycle. That was the other principle that we thought. So the main call from CSOs in FFP4 was precisely to have an establishment of a debt convention framework on sovereign debt, which is mainly to change this governance. Now, what would it address? And yeah, of course, there are so many questions about what they would address, what would the debt convention would entail, and actually it would entail everything from debt restructuring processes. It should be the approach should be decided in this body, and they could also, everyone wants debt swaps, creditors, borrowers. I mean, debt swaps will not fix any crisis at all, but if everyone wants a debt swap, okay, but let's make a decision on the main principles within this body. So it would address basically all policies around debt, but with all the parties sitting at the same table. We didn't get it. It was in the paragraph for a while, but then it was removed because it was a point of negotiation between developed countries, the EU versus developing countries, the G77, and the African Union, and so on. So what we do have, and what we call Atlantic Net, is windows of opportunities. We didn't get this big change that we wanted, but there are some windows of opportunities that we have to really open them and hopefully turn it into the big doors. One of them, and the most important, is the intergovernmental process at the UN to make recommendations on debt architecture reform. So this could lead to a debt convention framework at some point. This is currently in the General Assembly agenda. We don't know when it will be addressed, probably after the new Secretary General is in place. But if this happens, it could have the same path as taxation had with the UN Tax Convention. So this is one of the key and most important windows regarding the change of governance. But other issues also took place or were decided in the Compromiso de Sevilla. For instance, the borrowers' platform, which would make it possible to be a space of exchange between borrowers. It's a start. I hope that at some point it could turn into a very solid block of borrowers negotiated and putting proposals on the table. That would be my expectation. But for now, it needs to start without creating, without touching as, no, without making concerns or growing concerns in creditors. So currently, this platform has 7 countries on board. It was launched in April. I know you know that Egypt is the interim chair, and it will have like an official start in October in the sidelines of the IMF annual meetings in Bangkok, and they will adopt a communique. So if we can consider if this community wants to say something about that in October as well, when it will start the first year of the borrowers platform, and they will have actually mid-June, so probably now they will start with the first meeting in Maldives, led by Pakistan. The topic that it will be discussed is the development of domestic capital markets. I think that this is probably because we don't want to create much expectations from creditors. Say you are going to talk about us. No, we're going to talk about domestic debt, basically. So probably that's part of the strategy. But there are so many topics that the borrowers platform can also discuss and exchange. And we can be observers. There are going to be observers besides the countries, the official countries. So this could be a good opportunity to continue and follow up. Another window of opportunity is setting up this group in the UN in terms of the implementation of the guidelines and principles of responsible lending and borrowing. And this is something that as CSOs we have been calling for a long time as well. There is currently a list of candidates under review in the UN, and after that they should start their job and process. The main objective would be the implementation, probably some update in terms of the principles, update in terms of the curriculum landscape and so on, but it's basically about the implementation and that creditors and borrowers start to use it and implement it under their own bylaws, for instance. Then another important topic is the establishment of a global debt registry. It will be hosted in the World Bank. I don't know how it turned out to be in the World Bank, probably because they do have some statistics on debt. Our main objective when we proposed this was to have a final bondholder registry, because we knew that when countries need to restructure a debt, countries don't even know who they owe to or who they need to renegotiate it with. And Argentina is still one of our most emblematic cases where the government didn't know who was holding their sovereign bonds. This is not yet the objective, but it could be. Now, the important thing is also to have one single and complete database, which it currently doesn't exist. You can reach several sources of data, the World Bank, the IMF, at regional levels as well, and they don't match at all. So if you want to make a debt analysis, you don't know what data to use, and it's not that they are wrong. They all have good figures, but it depends on what they are taking. Some of them are taking this type of debt, some of them they are not. So to have one single database could be useful, hoping that it will address the whole debt, public debt data, including domestic debt, for instance. So let's see. But this is an important opportunity to advocate the World Bank. What do we need as well? Then there is the credit rating agencies, which is very linked to it. It's not exactly part of the debt chapter, but it's very linked with debt because it's part of the high costs of financing, the high costs in terms of interest rates for debt. And the outcome document recognizes that there is a need to discuss the role, the methodologies of credit rating agencies. There have been already a meeting that was stated in the Compromiso de Sevilla, and it happened in March this year. So it's good that it's now part of it. And the G7, for instance, recently in their communique, they recognized that there is a borrowers platform, just to mention in the sidelines. One important thing, I don't know if my colleagues will talk about this, is that the Compromiso in terms of credit rating agencies also recognizes and the African Credit Rating Agency, which is something that it's part of the proposal of several stakeholders, including us, as Latina, in terms of having an independent CRA. It would be important to see what is the next, or the first country that is rated by the African Credit Rating Agency, to know the methodology. If we are criticizing the current methodologies, it would be good to know what would be this new methodology to have a fair rating in terms of an African country. So that it's also a good step to follow up on this issue. And the last point is the Sevilla Debt Forum. This probably is not welcome by everybody. It's going to be led by Spain, and the idea is to have a space to promote implementation of the whole debt chapter, and at least that's what I would expect. It's not happening yet. There isn't really much information, and there are several other forums like the Paris Forum, but what it would be important if this takes place in Spain, it's your region in Europe, to have this could be an opportunity to continue pushing for the implementation of these good points that we have in the chapter in the FFT board. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Patricia. So a lot of some key windows of opportunities, as you said, that lay ahead: the governmental process, the borrowers platform, the working group on responsible lending and borrowing, the global debt registry, credit ratings, the Sevilla Forum. Quite some work for us and for Global South countries. Let me turn now to Kamal. The African group was one of the most vocal country groups in FFT4 on the need for an overhaul of the debt architecture, maybe together with the small island developing states. Those were the two groups that were really fighting, even supporting the proposal for a UN debt convention. Something that was somehow reflected in the Lomé Declaration, a little bit less, but also in the African Union Common African Position on Debt. So I wanted to ask you about these efforts. How do you see the efforts by the African Union and the African group at the UN on debt? If you could share what are, in your opinion, the main transformative elements, particularly of the Common African Position on Debt? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be here with you all, and it's great to see some very familiar faces. So I'm going to come in with another saying to follow my the example of Professor Wallace, which is it's a Chinese saying that says you need to cross the river by feeling the stones. And the idea behind that is that, when you can't always see how the land is beneath the water, you have to really use your toes and your feet to feel your way through, right? And on our journey to debt justice, which is the theme of today's and tomorrow's conference, we are really treading in uncertain waters and uncertain ground. And the world really is feeling with their feet as we make our way towards that. And I think this is really reflected in the Common African Position on Debt, which is also called CAP, right? An easier way to go about that. And CAP is really has two main pillars to it. Right? The first pillar is around crisis response. And that crisis response is looking at things like strengthening the G20 common framework, institutionalizing the profiling mechanism, including debt service suspensions during restructurings, special drawing rights access. And then there's a second pillar, which is looking at sustainable finance and long-term institutional resilience. And that's looking at things like DRM, transparency, risk monitoring, legal issues, regional coordination and macro convergence, local currency bonds, and notably a UN framework convention on debt. So this is now the African Union's position, is that we must advance a UN convention framework on debt. This kind of has its vision within the African Union's Vision 2063. But to get to this point, there was an AU technical meeting in Lusaka in 2022. There was the 2025 Lome Declaration. And then this year, the CAP, the Common African Position on Debt, was established. Of course, the Lome Declaration had supported the AU Commission, and now the CAP has support at the ministerial level of the AU itself. So, you know, obviously there's the crisis response, but there's also kind of laying the foundations for systemic reform. But, you know, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are in a world in which the future is very uncertain, and there is this move away from UN binding processes, right? And I think that as civil society, we must just be really honest and clear about that, right? The respect for UN processes, international law, international conventions is really under siege. And we must be clear that, you know, advancements on this aren't going to happen in the short or medium term, right? That really is a long-term project at a point at which the dynamics of power and political economy allow countries to coordinate in a serious way on joint rules. But that's not the world that we live in now, right? And the world that we live in now is more about groups and kind of instruments and processes that are regional and that are amongst coalitions of the willing, right? And so one of these groups that's definitely an ally in the UN convention is the Africa Group, right? And it's been a hugely powerful force in the UN Tax Convention, and can definitely be a huge force for change in the UN Debt Convention. That being said, the forces against that exist within your constituencies, right? It's the UK, it's the US, it's Europe, right? Those are the blockers of the UN Convention on Debt. And we saw this in the recent FFD forum that happened in earlier this year in April. Is the bloc that was really pushing against any language on a UN debt convention was the European Union, right? And so this needs to be a huge advocacy objective, I think, for this group in particular. So that's the first point on the convention. The second point on the convention is ministries of finance are not taking FFD seriously. Okay, so this is something we also need to appreciate. This is something, FFD is being taken seriously by the foreign affairs ministries, right? The ministries of finance, when you speak to them, they're like, that thing in the UN, you know, we hold the purse of our countries, and that's not something that we take into our calculations or considerations. So ministries of finance are not taking this seriously. The World Bank and the IMF are not taking this seriously. And I think that if our advocacy does not engage those elements, it will just be words on paper. So that's just the second point on advocacy and how we think about the targets of our advocacy. Coming back to the Africa Group, one of the things that's just been established in the Africa Group is this kind of focus on conventions. So the Africa Group is very serious about the tax and debt conventions, but they're also looking at how to integrate those conversations into other conversations happening around trade and industrial policy. So that's something to consider as well. ECOSOC in particular, within ECOSOC, there's been the establishment of an A14 or an Africa 14, which aims to coordinate African positions in a similar way as the A3 does in the Security Council, which is essentially just making statements on behalf of the Africa group itself. And they made their first statement together in ECOSOC yesterday. So this is a huge opportunity in my opinion. And then, just to conclude, going back to the question around long-term transformational changes to the system versus, shorter-term wins. The borrowers platform is a site of struggle at the moment, right? The US and the EU really want to crush it as much as they can, because they recognize that although it isn't a borrowers club where countries are negotiating in groups in times of default, the establishment of a platform does not preclude that possibility in the future, right? And that's something that they fear. And so this is something I think that we should put as much energy behind as a step in the short term, as a short-term win. Currently, I think there's about 15 countries that have signed up to it, but this would be an important place to put some energy in from the European perspective to lobby your governments towards supporting that platform. And I think the juxtaposition of a borrower's platform, which is something that's kind of a shorter term, obviously not transformational, and something like a UN tax convention, brings me to another Chinese proverb, which is that we must cross the river by laying the stones. And that this river needs to be crossed, but there's parts of which we might not be able to swim through, and there are rapids, that we might not be able to make our way through by swimming. And so we need to place the rocks, and we need to place the pebbles so that we are able to cross the river. And things like the UN the borrowers platform are the kind of rocks and the pebbles that we need to use to place as we make our way across the river. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Kamal. And right time, I really like it that to cross the river, we need to lay and fill the stones. Many of these stones can be found in the Common African Position on Debt, in the African group positions, in the borrowers platform. I agree, and kudos to our colleagues at UNCTAD for really pushing this forward. But the blockers that make us stumble as we attempt to cross are particularly the European Union and countries like the UK, many other global north creditor countries. So we have also, Jerome, not to speak on behalf of the UK government. No. We saw also in the negotiations of the Seville outcome document how after months of negotiations, the global south countries even managing to retain some positive language on the intergovernmental process and on legislation, and I think it said major jurisdictions, the UK and the European Union made dilutions in the language. Also to come at the end, the European Union disassociating from one paragraph in the governmental paragraph on the agreement. But well, we may have opportunities ahead. The UK has the G20 presidency next year. They have already said that they want to put debt at the core of the agenda. And we wanted to ask what is it that we can expect from the UK government and that process, but also from the UK civil society that's been organizing for a long time. And I think that's where our hopes lay. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Yolanda. Yes, the UK G20 presidency, is it one of Patricia's windows of opportunity, despite the UK's consistently dreadful role on debt and everything else internationally, and despite obviously the total lack of legitimacy of the UK to work on, of the G20 rather, to work on debt, to this self-appointed creditors club that's arrogated itself the right to set the rules for international debt architecture. On that level, obviously not. The UN debt convention needs to be advanced through UN processes. The G20 is not the place to discuss it, and the UK is absolutely not the right host for those conversations. Nevertheless, I think the UK presidency can be a stepping stone on that steep slope. I haven't prepared a proverb, so sorry, that's it's a very mixed metaphor. Firstly, as Yolanda says, the UK is likely to make debt a priority for the 20 presidency, which means it's going to be on the agenda. They're going to be discussing it, left to themselves without lobbying. They're going to take this very complacent G20 consensus position that the common framework is working just slowly, give it more time. Somehow the countries that aren't applying will somehow magically it will get better. And they want to focus on liquidity solutions, which obviously don't address the debt crisis. Liquidity, voluntary contractual reforms, having nice conversations with their friends in the city of London to talk about future debt contracts for presumably the next debt crisis they're anticipating in 20 years. Maybe it'll slightly help that. It's not even low ambition. It's whatever is lower than lower ambition. So I think it's as UK declaration. I think we feel it's not a responsibility to push hard to challenge them on this complacency, to look at what could constructively be done through the G20, given the total failures so far of the common framework. I'm not going to dive into the UK political context. Obviously, we're a very unstable country. It's going into our next round of probably very boring for us instability. Just to sketch it, at the moment, things have been very difficult to make progress on debt and development agenda. Governments run by the Treasury, which prioritizes relationships with finance and city above everything else. And at a political level, there's this macho rhetoric of we don't care about development internationalism or anything that the left is interested to do, because we prioritize British people. So it's we have very little traction some traction with FCDO, Foreign Office, and Energy departments, but very little with the Treasury or 10 Downing Street. That's likely to change. I think we're pretty confident we'll have a new Prime Minister within weeks or months, and that he'll be Andy Burnham, who's from the more progressive wing of the party. And there'll be a lot of pressure on him to have some kind of appeal to the core Labour vote, which is almost entirely abandoned. So I won't get any further into it, but the point being that political context is helpful. The government's under a lot of pressure. They have a lot of MPs who do care about development, who work for NGOs like ours, who are going to have a lot more influence on the incoming Prime Minister than the current one. So even if we're not winning the argument yet, I think the G20 presidency is concentrating minds. We're all getting high-level conversations that we weren't getting a year ago. They were not. The Treasury are not just reading our papers and sort of glazing and then repeating they're looking like they're reading them a bit more carefully and acknowledging that there's problems in their position. So I think an achievable objective is to get a sense in these G20 conversations that the common framework isn't working, and that's a crucial first step, I think, for every aspect of our agenda leading towards the Eurodad convention. And so we've been working out with our allies in the UK and with a lot of input and feedback from allies in the South, particularly, and in Europe, on proposals around common framework reform as the focus for the UK's agenda at the G20, and UK private creditor legislation, similar to that that's being advanced in New York, the other main jurisdiction, as a crucial step to a crucial prerequisite for making the common framework even partially effective. It's going to be, I mean, there's a key opportunity here is that the vulture funds are stepping up at the right moments. VR Capital and Parallel Capital Management are doing us a political favour, if not Ethiopia a favour, by suing Ethiopia in the English courts. If that goes forward, it's still unclear. It's going to be a huge embarrassment for the UK to be trying to convene discussions on the top framework when creditors, some of them based in the UK, are using the English courts with an explicit agenda to destroy the common framework and sort of possibility of treatment, even on the really minimal level that it is applied. That's a political embarrassment from any perspective. So I think that gives us traction. And I think crucially, it's a moment for us in the UK to mobilise several of the coalition members are here to mobilise our sort of substantial supporter basis, get that political pressure running through MPs who often are quite sympathetic on this and the Labour Party to put this pressure on the incoming Prime Minister to use the G20 presidency to prioritise debt and to do something constructive on this, which could be a small first step on the road to that mentioned.
Thank you. I think we have opportunities there, not only with the G20 presidency, but maybe an intergovernmental process or dialogue on an intergovernmental process starting at the UN, the borrowers platform. Somehow the worsening of that context and situation will also raise more attention from media, from maybe policymakers, MPs, not only in the global south, but also in the global north, in Europe, to pay attention to the debt crisis. And we see how, and we have already also shared how the blockage of particularly the European Union and global north countries of ambitious debt architecture reforms, but also of short-term debt relief initiatives, even the reform of the common framework is not advancing, and it brought the opposition even to a discussion, which is an intergovernmental process. It all calls for a response. And calls for a response, particularly from European organizations, given the very problematic role of the European Union and European governments, including those not in the European Union, so the UK, the Nordics, Switzerland. And it calls for scandalizing the obstacles that these countries, these governments and institutions are posing to advance in urgent and necessary reforms. And this is why the Eurodad members came together in March this year and decided that we're going to run a specific advocacy and public campaigning, targeting European governments and policymakers. Running this Europe-wide campaign starting probably in autumn. This is also what we will be discussing in the workshop after the break. And any ideas that also the plenary may have on what is it that we need to focus on, what we can change, what are those stones that we need to lay in our river. They will be very welcome. I'm going to open now the floor. We have quite some time, some 40 minutes for 2 or 3 rounds of interventions, questions, but also comments. I'll get back to the panel after each round. I don't know if my colleagues... Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, I already see 2 hands. I don't know, May, if you also want to intervene. Yeah. Okay, let's start with May.
So good morning, everyone. And I'm very happy with the theme, reclaiming global economic governance in connection with the debt justice movement, of which I'm focused on as part of the Asian People's Movement on debt inequality. Because it also implicitly states what we all see as there's something wrong with the current way of global economic governance. But perhaps also moving towards identifying who's digging holes and setting traps in the river. That we must be also very clear who our targets are, because the backlash is really strong, and these are really very powerful blockers. And perhaps also time not to look at this as events or separate entities, but rather as part of a concerted movement of the interests that they represent. And based on that, what are we going to do as a way of really hitting hardest those systemic roots? Because as long as that is not eroded, as long as these entities continue with in their positions of power and dominance, those opportunities that we see will also be blocked and eroded, increasingly stronger and stronger. So that's just what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, May. Sorry to put you on the spot. David here, and then after that. And please introduce yourselves.
David Archer from ActionAid. I'm going to try and use this same metaphor of the stones and river and putting lots of stones. It seems to me that what might be happening is that the Seville Compromiso rips out lots of little stones that will just lead us into deeper water and we'll never get across it. And that actually what we need is to keep a very single-minded focus on the UN Debt Convention and that structural reform. It's a bit like what happened in FFD3 with the tax convention, where you had the OECD creating inclusive pillars, promising lots of lovely inclusive processes, and they never went anywhere. People wasted a lot of time and energy trying to make those things work until we actually ended up with taking a vote to the UN, the Africa group particularly taking the vote to the UN General Assembly and winning the momentum behind the debt convention. Should we keep ourselves focused on those structural things? And what are the prospects, in your view, perhaps particularly from the Africa group, about taking a vote to the General Assembly perhaps in 2027 to get those structural things? I do think there are opportunities in those little steps, but I'm a little bit worried that we could waste a lot of time and energy going down those paths if we don't keep our minds single-mindedly that we're using those steps only to advance the structural reforms of the debt convention. Welcome some reflections on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Siddharth. I work with the Coalition for Human Rights and Development. I'm going to take up Adia's invitation to sort of think intersectionally around military aid and debt and tax and currencies. And I have a question for Kamal, which is sort of, how do you think that, Burkina Faso's resource nationalization, or Senegal kicking out the French military bases, or even the other Sahel countries kicking out the French military bases, as well as sort of increasing movements to stepping away from the CFA franc, how do those steps by African countries build their leverage in debt and tax negotiations, if at all?
Okay, thank you. I don't see any others, so maybe we can go around answering. There was, what about a vote in the UN next year? What about these movements in Africa? Do you want to start, Patricia?
I can start reacting to some of the comments, and yes, David, I think that at some point it could be destructive. We have some issues and some of these windows of opportunities that are part of what could be discussed in the UN Convention framework. So the Convention framework is like this big umbrella where all these other pieces of the puzzle of what is the debt architecture could be discussed, should be discussed. And I think we need to, but at the same time, we need to keep a balance where to put our energies, because while we keep calling for, and we will, calling for a debt convention framework. At the same time, that sustainability analysis is being reviewed, and at the same time, and so there are also several things going on and happening. So we need to keep up with the balance on where to put our energies in this advocacy issue. And for instance, also the common framework reform or how to make it better. That is also such a big distraction. And or I could even say it's a waste of time, but maybe that's too much to say. But it's and you know that Latin America has basically middle income countries in the region. So to say let's improve the common framework so it can be used in middle income countries, that's really way too much to me, and that's really so destructive because it will go nowhere. So I think we need to be careful about these things, but also to balance that. And in terms of I would also, I don't know if who mentioned this, but it just came to my mind that the same problems in terms of the blockers that we had during the whole process in FFP4. Now it's the same challenges in terms of the implementation. I mean that there is a borrower's platform. It doesn't mean that okay, now everything is fine. We have a borrower's platform and we can keep thinking on a different thing now. No, because it's the same challenges and the same oppositions to these proposals are still present. So the implementation in terms of what would be the approach, the Compromiso de Sevilla is not really that detailed on what is the approach, what do we think from a economic justice perspective should be the approach. And this is the next challenge now in terms of advocating in the right implementation path, because it could take the wrong way as well. So I think that's also another important thing. And about the UN voting, well, I think based on the tax experience, I think this would be what we could bet on. I think that's instead of following the FFP process, to have the UN General Assembly vote in favor of the debt intergovernmental process, not just a dialogue, but just that's not enough, but it's to start already the intergovernmental process of that. That would be a good point. But we have several different alternatives. So until that doesn't happen, I think we need to continue throwing all the stones, as we say, in the path and see during that what happens and how to continue. I mean, we don't get to the objective just with going with the step 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes we go to 4, then come back to 2. So I think it's a process, and I think that to be very active in the whole process from our side, it's crucial, and to keep up with the advocating and with the strategy. I mean, it's not enough. It's not that we have the compromiso. We need to continue now with the right implementation.
Thank you. Kamal?
Thank you so much for your questions, David, Siddhartha. Is it Siddhartha or Siddhartha? Siddhartha. Yeah. So the question on the vote in the National and the General Assembly, I think Patricia has kind of put this in the answer that I would do. But I also would really push back against the idea that if that was even voted and we demanded a special sitting tonight and there was a vote and it was agreed upon, what would happen, right? Even if the US was and the UK were outvoted, do you think that they would still, for example, even if the entire process ended today, right? And it said that there are specific rules on comparability of treatment, and there are specific rules on ensuring that private creditors abide by those. And even if our entire kind of advocacy objectives were integrated into that framework and it was implemented tonight, do you really think that private capital in New York and London would abide by those rules? And if your answer is no, then what does the convention matter? Right? So if we're not thinking about it in terms of the ability for the US government to discipline capital in New York, and if we're not thinking about it in terms of the ability of a Labour government or to discipline capital in London, and if that ability to discipline does not exist, then forget your convention, right? So this is a long-term project, right? And it has to be an internationalist one, because as soon as perhaps Imam Danistan, our good friend, is able to discipline private capital in his jurisdiction, will they not move to Texas? Right? So the convention is necessary for the rule to apply to every state within the US, and for the convention to apply to every state in the world, so that Luxembourg and other tax havens do not create this race to the bottom. But are the power relations between states and private capital such that those international laws and treaties will have effect, right? And that, I think, maybe takes us far beyond the campaigning of our debt justice discussions. And what it does is it takes us into the question that Siddharth asked, which is how do you create those power relations within a nation state, right? And definitely having control over resources within your borders has a huge impact on that. And the private accumulation within your borders has a huge impact on that. So that's definitely something to consider. And then, of course, thinking about debt in terms of power is a very useful way to go about this. I'm sure many of us have read David Graeber's Debt in the First 5,000 Years. But speaking about your question around kicking the French out, right, of West Africa, right, and how world diplomacy has an impact on your ability to collect revenues or to subordinate a former colony, right? But also what it speaks to, I think, and what you're hinting at as well, is that as the international system fragments, we are seeing more and more regional configurations. And I think that that's what we're going to see more and more. We're going to see more and more regional configurations around resources, around military, and around coalitions. And I suppose we could think of the Boris platform as one such coalition that should be supported. But of course, other forms of power around armies and currencies and national control of resources are going to be debates that we need to take more seriously as smaller countries try to protect themselves from the big dogs. Thank you.
Very briefly, Senegal's fascinating. The government's taking this really strong position, throwing out the French military, to recently strong messaging on against the IMF on leaving the CFA franc, and yet we're still saying, but we're going to pay our debts in full. And I think we need to throw some stones at some private creditors here. While there's this massive power imbalance that private creditors think they're untouchable and they can get, they're increasingly wanting to be paid in full. Indebted countries feel like they can do everything except any debt relief at all. Then we're not even moving. We need some interim steps to address that massive power imbalance.
Thank you. I totally agree. I also think I'm facilitator / speaker here. I also think that we need to think of the past processes, because we had a process at the UN in 2015 that creditor countries disregarded totally, and it went nowhere. So when we have a vote, we need to have done our job, particularly in Europe, to make sure that vote leads to a meaningful process. And that also means advancing on legislation because I totally agree. I mean, the only way is to discipline capital and to shame and throw stones, not literally, to private creditors. So all needs to go in parallel and also, I mean, we have a tax process. Let's also not push too much on the UN delegates to start yet another process while they are still focusing and investing a lot of efforts and energies in the tax process. Let's the tax process finish well, and then we do our work, and then we push for that vote. If it's 2027, then great. If it's 2028, great as well. But we need to have done our work, I think. Luis, and if others want to speak, please raise your hands.
Thanks, Luis with the Bretton Woods Project. Yeah, super interesting discussion. Thanks, everyone. I wanted to suppose to make a couple points and maybe raise some issues for thinking. I like to begin by emphasizing what Kamal noted, which is, I've always noticed there's a very, very strong schism between what happens in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responsible for the rights frameworks, etc., and what happens in the Treasury and central banks. You can see this from the appointing discussions, etc. And so I think we really need to do a better job collectively of engaging with those officials and outlining our own rationale as to why they need to be involved and why what we're proposing is of benefit to these states. And I think that while the situation is in flux, etc., I do think that there are opportunities, particularly in Europe, more so than the UK, so European Union. I sat in on a roundtable in DC during springs, and there was a closed-door meeting about the role of Europe in the world today, given the flux in multilateralism, the perceived, well, not perceived, the realization that Europe can no longer count on the US as its, dependable ally, let's say, and also this, however valid or invalid, the perception of China. So the discussion was, well, how does Europe navigate its way through these hegemons, right? And a lot of the discussion focus on alliance. How can Europe rebuild alliances in the global south? I know this is all instrumental. I know, of course, we need to focus on the rights and demands of the global south. But I think we do have an opening. Europe just signed a trade agreement with Mercosur. They were sitting in the wings for 25 years. That wasn't accidental. There's a very specific reason why it happened now. And I think we could do a better job of engaging central banks and treasuries to say, if Europe is really serious about de-risking its alliances with the US and China to a certain extent, you really need to start acting on your, we're a dependable partner with the global south. And I think that's something that treasuries and central banks, etc., that's something that might have more traction than the approaches we have been using thus far. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Benjamin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Benjamin from Germany. I work with Miseria, Catholic Development Organization, and some of you might know. We just recently published in English our global sovereign debt monitor report, which we do together with Jubilee. So I Jubilee Germany, so I invite you to check it out. So one of the asks that we make in the report is also for the debt, the framework convention, of course, and many other things. But just to share a reflection about the discussion in Germany. So we speak with our finance ministry. We were in parliament last week to present the report. But what we get, especially from the finance ministry, is that they're really not interested in this discussion about moving any of the discussions to the UN process. I think they're quite comfortable and really do want to keep discussing within the G20 and the IMF in particular. And I mean, we have been trying, what the previous speaker just said, we've been trying this approach about speaking about new alliances, also for Germany, kind of a middle power. But what I can share from the German discussion is that we do not have traction also using, let's say, an alternative approach to this. And what they're asking us, they're still willing to speak with us, but they want to speak about debt transparency and they want to speak about improving the common framework. And if we have, good thoughts on that, yes, then we can have a meaningful discussion with them. But if we keep just saying, UN and we want framework convention, then it's really difficult to address finance ministry officials. I really would like to ask the room about your experiences and also the panel on how you deal with this on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, I mean, we have to work through our government, but how do we keep this discussions open and kind of trying to reach both goals, the big goal towards the UN, but also smaller improvements. What are the trade-offs and how do you do? Thank you very much.
I have
so there can be different types of strategies, but there's a difference, and I know that we talk a lot about the tax and how well it's going, but debt has different tones to it, and I think one of the biggest challenges facing debt is going to be the fact that a country is never going to be able to ask for debt forgiveness. It's never going to be able to come to the table and say it wants a freezing or a moratorium. Whereas a country can go and demand for a change in the tax system, can demand for new international frameworks. And I think that this is where civil society can be incredibly powerful, because you can demand it because they can't. And often when I speak with governments say, if we turn around and we say, we have hidden debt, which is what happened in Senegal, then people say there's a question mark on our administrative and accountability systems. Then the next time we want a debt, that is what is raised to prevent us from getting the next debt. So this whole sort of the link into credit rating then becomes the biggest obstacle or the stone being thrown at them, as it were, when it comes to the issues around debt. So the one is to see that will have to have inherently a different approach. And then what that approach will take. And I think the different stakeholders can come into that space in very different ways from facts. And so you can ask for the framework convention, but there is also, pushing at multiple levels from multiple spaces, not because we want them to say we want to overwhelm them, but because the entire system is connected. And if we finish the conversations on tax before we put to bed conversations around debt, then we might have the opportunity of missing out. Why are we collecting the tax? To pay off the debt. Also, right? There are those interlinkages. And I think that there is a strategy to be played with, as it were, there to actually take the conversation forward.
Thanks. Hi, Emma Ferguson with Questionnaire. Thanks so much for the conversation. Great. I just wanted to share another sort of very reformist small opportunity, but I do think it can matter. So the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office is doing an evaluation right now on the IMF's role on debt in links. And this is a long-term review. They're going back, like basically since trying to tell a story of what's happened since the big. And and they're trying to get to this sort of explanation for policymakers of how have we landed back into this crisis, right? I think that narrative that comes out of that will really matter, because when we have these discussions with European policymakers, treasury folks about things like the sovereign debt workout mechanism or the treaty or the convention, the narrative they very much refer back to the story that comes out of the IMF on this, which is, we've tried that and it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because the US didn't support it at the time, and so never mind, don't worry about it. It's not worth pursuing, that's what you hear. So one of the chapters of this evaluation is about the role of the IMF in the global debt architecture. So it's sort of looking outside of, its own role. And I think there's an opportunity there to have them tell a slightly more interesting story than what they've been sharing so far. When they started drafting that, it was incredibly uninteresting. The question they were answering is sort of, has the IMF supported the implementation of what the G20 decides on debt? You know, have we implemented the DSSI and now the common framework? I think that's completely the wrong, question to be answering, because we all know the answer to that. So I and other types like Chetla here have been encouraging them to be way more honest about the role that the IMF plays in blocking and advising Europeans, especially, to continue to block this global debt architectural reform that we talk about in FFD, right? And so I don't know what will happen with this evaluation, but at least in terms of how a lot of European policymakers understand, even, I was in a meeting recently where we were talking about sovereign debt workout mechanism and legislation. And the only thing that was being discussed with government officials was the IMF model when they tried it, when they proposed it back when. I pointed out that, in Latin American countries, this has been a conversation since the 1930s. And this isn't an IMF idea, you know what I mean? But they really were surprised by that. So again, just recapturing some of the narrative, maybe through this evaluation and other opportunities when we speak to Europeans, I think is important. Thanks.
Yeah, we can have, but let's go to Bodo back there and then Luis. Oh, okay, and then Boots.
Yeah,
Then
very much
the final.
of Europe. Very interesting discussion, much has been said already. I mean, coming to how to kick off an intergovernmental process at the United Nations, I think the most logical thing is indeed to have a resolution by the second committee of the General Assembly. And at the moment, this will necessarily be voted, I think, because at the moment, the USA is blocking basically even the most trivial resolutions at the United Nations. So I think voting is, the first step is to find some champions in the second committee of the General Assembly to put it forward. The second is going to have a vote. But indeed, and Yolanda, you pointed at that, in 2015, only G77 countries supported this process of the legal framework. So you would need to create some more ownership among the other member states. At the moment, we don't really get the US on board, I think. The question is then how to do it. And I think we didn't really communicate very well yet why legal framework or that convention makes this is good for everyone, basically. It's because Louis, you pointed at the Mercosur agreement and the tax negotiations. Indeed, European countries, Mercosur agreement is beneficial for both sides if you like free trade. There are different views on it, basically. The tax, we know that the Europeans participate in the tax convention because of the geopolitical pressure but also because they saw a need in creating global tax rules. So, there is an understanding in Europe that global tax rules could be beneficial for the European side as well. On that, I think it's actually not so difficult. Insolvency law is relative. Even corporate insolvency law only dates back for the 19th century. Before that, even corporate insolvency was an extremely messy process and created a more efficient system, basically. Now one wants to get rid of a legal, orderly procedure in corporate insolvency, so people have understood that it's a good thing to have. And I think we need to convey this message a little bit better also to European governments, that it's not just, it's not something that would be used against them, but it's something that creates a more efficient system that is beneficial for everyone, because otherwise in the current context, I think it's quite difficult to get them on board. Having said all that, just to caveat, we always had in the debt movement some people who are very against the debt workout mechanism and also the legal framework, like our very radical friends from CADTM and so on. This can also go wrong. A legal framework can also strengthen creditor rights. Just to let you know, that was always their argument. At the moment, the argument was always, developing countries should just default and repudiate, basically. And depending on how negotiations go, a legal framework is not necessarily beneficial for the debtor side only. It can also strengthen the creditors. So once negotiations start, you really need to make sure that that this doesn't go into the wrong direction. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have Brad and the project colleagues here.
I'm John, also with Redwoods Pilot. I'll try to be brief. I think maybe again looking at the UK G20. Another small window is linking these issues back to the inequality question. I think in the UK, the policy space has really been captured by the City of London to a great extent. And I think that's a real weakness in this current context where Elon Musk is becoming a trillionaire. You know, to sort of return back to this question of what we're up against. Some of you may have seen that the secret society of Peter Thiel was leaked. And Scott Bessent is on the list for this resort. And so this convening that's happening in Ireland, which is about cult building, is one of the topics, and prepping for World War III. But you know, there's a larger political project here around fragmenting the state, whether that's through special economic zones or offshore tax havens. This is a very explicit sort of political project of the people at the top of the sort of current, extraction of wealth, right? And so I think while this is a very technical issue, in terms of the sort of like broader political agenda we could create with the UK G20, I think that sort of making those sort of linkages could help capture the public imagination. And then maybe just to link to tomorrow's session on development finance, private capital mobilization is once again being reanimated despite its many failures. And the use of MDBs to provide more guarantees, etc. That's another way of sort of making private finance have greater seniority in practice, right? So I think linking these discussions back to the economic justice lens is of course super important in sort of bringing it out of the technical realm and trying to have this bigger public discussion around inequality, the insane wealth of trillionaires, et cetera, which I think everyone across the political spectrum is sort of, there's an increasing awareness that this is a massive societal problem.
Thank you. Chris?
Thanks, apologies for speaking twice, but just reflecting on a couple of things, one of which is related to what John just said and what Kamal said about this capital. We live in strange times, right? Because I think one of the things that brings extreme right and extreme left together to a certain extent related to the rising inequality is antagonism in some parts towards capital, towards financial capital in particular, which can be quite useful, right? And in that regard, I think one of the other things that we need to address is, I remember we were in a meeting in Marrakesh with a governmental delegation from a European state. And their basic question was, we tried that restructuring before, it didn't work. We're in the same place again. So, what tell us how this is going to turn out differently. And I think we're in a junction where we can make the argument, with all the caveats that are associated with it, the World Banks and the funds changing perspective on industrial policy is an opening. I think we're having someone write a piece for us on industrial policy, basically arguing that, we no longer live in 1970s and 80s and such. Things have changed. And I think we engage in these discussions with treasuries and central banks in Europe and saying, we're no longer at that stage. We're in a different stage. If we're talking about diversification of, supply chains, etc. And I know I'm instrumentalizing things from a European perspective. So, I think there are openings there, if we're going to speak about openings, like reframing a little bit our narrative. And but just to be clear, I don't necessarily support the Mercosur agreement, but my government does. It's a complicated thing. So, but politically, it's a significant step. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. We're getting to the limit of our time. Oh, we have Aldo. Okay, 2 minutes maximum, and then we'll go 1 minute each.
So, congratulations for the presentations, and I'm very happy to see how the keynote speaker and Kamal coordinate in advance on Robert's. No, but I want to ask you a question. Why is nobody suggesting as a day for a vote 2026? So I hear 2027 or later. So we gave up on 2026 for what happened. And the second, I feel that one of the things that we need to figure out in terms of strategies, we need to have clarity about the way to get there. So what exactly is the vote about? And in that sense, I think the outcome from Sevilla creates some confusion because it's not a vote on a convention. It's it's about recommendations for addressing gaps in international financial architecture, which is kind of an intermediate step. And maybe we don't need that. I mean, if there can be a vote on initiating a convention, we need to just have the. And I think that was a debate we had before Sevilla. If do we really need Sevilla to say something, why not just go through the General Assembly and to have a vote? But I think when you talk to delegates, as I have, nobody has clarity about the path to get there, to get to a convention and what exactly a vote would be about. And I think that's something that we need to offer ourselves some clarity on how that could be done. Maybe it's wrong, but at least, with something like that, we initiate the process of thinking. And last, so I think we also need to think about the faith-based dimension of this in really 2025, which we always said it was going to be a 5-year campaign, and not to say that we achieve it in 5 years, but it was, it wasn't like 2000, where 2000 was like the end point of the campaign. 2025 was the beginning point of the campaign. There was no campaign before, right? So, and the Vatican is on record and continues to be on record calling for this. So that's something that I think we also need to strategically use. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, would you like to have 1 minute last comment, each of you? Close. You can start. Yeah, we can go. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll pick up on a few of the points around advocacy, political advocacy strategy, going via foreign affairs ministries, which is certainly something that we have done and are continuing to do in the UK with this narrative of you've cut overseas development aid, that there's no money, that is something that's cost neutral, that could rebuild those relationships that we've been actively touching. And they were, and I think are interested, but the problem is they talk to Treasury talks to the city, as it's been observed, and then the answer comes back no. So that's the politics around that might shift. So I think that's still open. I think one of the crucial, I think that this point around the foreign affairs ministers have been saying to us that African indebted countries. I was there last week. They said their debt was under control. They're not asking for this. Of course they do. I mean, I don't know how far that's a good faith comment, but one of the things we're doing, we're using the Common African Position, the May Declaration, to talk to the AU group of high commissioners and ambassadors in London and support them to articulate shared positions and demands that are regional positions already to the UK to put more pressure, so that it's not just a UK civil society or a global civil society campaign. It's coming in ways that are politically acceptable for governments to the UK and potentially the G20.
Thank you. Well, just to go faster on several points, yes, the convention framework should also include domestic legislations in creditor countries. We talk about regulating the capital market, but also in borrower countries. We also need our own debt legislations to protect basically ourselves. So that's one thing. Then this problem that was mentioned between if it's ministries of finance and central banks and ministries of foreign affairs, and I had the same impression after Sevilla. Attending the IMF meetings, it's like what happens in the UN stays at the UN. And this is a challenge also for the UN itself and for ECOSOC and for UNDESA and from UNCTAD with the Borrowers Platform. And it is a challenge. And it's not only in the North, in your countries in Europe, it's also in the Global South, in our countries. It's basically the same. The ministries of finance will either know what ministries of foreign affairs are saying at the UN meetings. So it is a challenge. I think that the fact of selecting focal points in ministries of finance from UN side, selecting these focal points for the implementation of the Compromiso de Sevilla, it's a good step. And it's going to have to take place also in the borrowers platform. They want to have focal points in issues of finance. So there are steps being taken towards this, but it is a challenge, I think, in every country, and that's also part of the role that we have as CSOs to reach our governments in your countries, in our countries. I think that's part of one of our key roles. And Emma, what you said on the IMF role, I think that's very interesting. It's important. It is a window of opportunity as well. And it's funny how I think sometimes no one takes a charge, takes the role on debt at the global level. So the G7 says, oh, the common framework is not ours, it's the G20, so it's not us. And the G20 and the IMF says also, no, it's the G20, but the IMF is the main advisor of the G20. And when they approve it, they finally the IMF is implementing those decisions. So, but in the end, no one takes who is in charge. And so I think this could be an interesting conversation. And finally, I think that it's important to retake the messages. John, you were also mentioning this about what worked in the 2000 campaign on debt. It was the link mainly with poverty. I think now poverty is still not over, but inequalities is really an important part to link with debt. The debt campaign was so successful the last time, and even in 2005, after the 2000 campaign, even in 2005, the campaign was still on because it had different stages. So in 2005, we still have more results in terms of debt relief. So it was a successful campaign. I think there's lots of experiences to take from there to link with not only poverty, inequality, but also with life. I mean, to link that it's a matter of lives of people at stake with not addressing that in the right way. So I think we need to retake these messages, not only for the campaign, but also for the convention framework and for all these conversation and objectives that we have at global, regional levels in our countries, with our governments, with our parliamentarians as well. So yeah, I think that's a lot of food for thought to continue our job. Thank you.
I don't have anything more to say.
Okay, so sorry.
So I'll just use my 1 minute to say thank you very much, everyone, for using my metaphor for our discussion. And yeah, thank you for bringing us together, Eurodad, and it's great to be